In the opening weeks of World War I, SMS Emden had already wiped out 60% of Allied commerce. Emboldened by this wave of terror, Korvettenkapitän Karl von Müller set his sights on a target far beyond mere merchant ships. On September 22, 1914, the German cruiser approached Madras, one of the British Empire's key ports on the Indian coast, where vulnerable oil tanks lay exposed along the shoreline. Under cover of darkness, the Emden silently glided toward the well-lit harbor, its 4.1-inch guns trained on the massive containers. As searchlights pierced the night, revealing the defenseless shoreline facilities, the command rang out. The guns roared. The first salvos fell short, but the third found its mark. An explosion rocked the harbor as 5,000 tons of oil erupted into a fiery cloud. Amid the flames, von Müller stood silent at the bridge. He was simultaneously filled with excitement and dread in what was yet to come. His single German cruiser had just forced the mighty British Admiralty to hunt them down. It was about to be 14 versus 1, and that was secretly what he'd been wanting all along. A new ship. At the dawn of the 20th century, Germany was a rising empire whose ambitions extended far beyond Europe to the Pacific. To defend its foothold in the region, Britain relied on the German East Asia Squadron, a fleet designed to project power in a world dominated by the legendary fearsome Royal Navy. Stationed in Tsingtao, China, the squadron was led by Konteradmiral Maximilian von Spee, a seasoned commander whose fleet was fast, mobile, and dangerous, a mix of armored and light cruisers and others. But in the age of steam, power came at a cost. Every warship was chained to its fuel supply, and without coal, even the most powerful fleet was nothing more than floating hunks of steel waiting to be hunted down. With war looming, the Allies wouldn't let Germany's stronghold in China stand for long. But among von Spee's fleet was a ship that wouldn't rely on a whole battle group to make her mark. Instead, she would fight her war alone. In 1913, Korvettenkapitän Karl von Müller, a career officer with 23 years in the German Navy, took command of SMS Emden, a sleek Dresden-class light cruiser displacing 3,500 tons. A disciplined and sharp skipper, known for his calm and calculated leadership, Müller had the complete confidence of his crew. At his side was his second-in-command, Captain Lieutenant Helmut von Mucke, whose chaotic boldness balanced the captain's precision. During the summer of 1914, with newspapers printing endless headlines about bubbling hostilities all across Europe, life on the colony of Tsingtao, where Emden sat anchor, carried on as usual. That June, British cruiser HMS Minotaur arrived in port, bringing an air of camaraderie rather than conflict. The visit became an elaborate affair hosted by the German East Asia Squadron, where officers and sailors from both navies mingled at a grand banquet. Laughter filled the halls all night, and toasts were raised to shared seas rather than battle lines. The two crews squared off at friendly competitions of different sports in the following days. Between the rivalry and revelry, as Minotaur prepared to depart Tsingtao, no one expected that Britain and Germany would ever be enemies. The war is on. Yet, as the celebrations faded over the coming days, Konteradmiral Spee ordered the veteran sailors aboard many of his ships to be replaced by fresh recruits, and training became the utmost priority. The men got quickly accustomed to operating the 25-knot maximum speed ship's inner mechanics and her 10 4.1-inch naval guns, supplemented by 9 5-pounder guns, 4 machine guns, and 2 torpedo tubes. On June 28, 1914, when Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, was assassinated in Sarajevo by Gavrilo Princip, a Bosnian Serb nationalist, the regional crisis quickly spiraled as alliances were activated and ultimatums were issued. Within weeks, Europe was in conflict. What came to be known as the Great War, or World War I, had barely begun when Emden went hunting for the very first time. Patrolling off the Korean peninsula in the early hours of August 4th, the German cruiser's lookout spotted movement on the horizon, the unmistakable shape of 4 long and lean funnels. Suspecting this might be the Russian-protected cruiser Askold, a warship and a prize well worth taking, a sudden call to action ran across Emden's decks. As spotlight swept across the waves, the crew scrambled to their stations, and gunners trained their weapons on the distant ship. Captain Karl von Müller gave the order to intercept. SMS Emden surged forward, engines firing at full power, shrinking the range between them. When the Russians refused to stop, the German ship let loose a series of powerful warning shots until the Russian captain gave in. However, when a boarding party from Emden jumped onto the target, they realized they had not overtaken the cruiser Askold, but rather the 3,500-ton Russian merchant ship Ryazan. Despite not carrying valuable cargo, Müller wasn't about to let the fast, modern vessel go. At dawn on August 6th, both ships steamed into Tsingtao, the German war flag now flying over Ryazan's deck. Within weeks, the captured vessel was repainted, refitted, and reborn under a new name, SMS Cormoran. She took on a new purpose as a raider in Germany's growing war at sea. The Lonesome Raider. With the Great War barely a week old, on August 13th, Admiral von Spee, despite his decades of experience, found himself in a predicament. His German East Asia squadron, composed of 2 armored cruisers, 4 light cruisers, and a fleet of supply ships, was far from home, cut off from their coal reserves, and already being hunted. Without fuel, remaining in the region would mean certain destruction once Allied forces closed in. Instead, he set his sights on the Eastern Pacific, where the neutral ports of South America could provide coal, and British merchant vessels would offer easier targets. Rather than leaving the Western Pacific entirely in Allied hands, von Spee ordered SMS Emden to stay behind, the Lone Raider's only company being the supply ship Marcomannia, carrying 6,000 tons of coal and acting as her lifeline in the vast ocean. But the coal wouldn't last forever. If Emden wanted to keep sailing, she would have no choice but to hunt. The very next day, Emden and Marcomannia set off on their independent raiding mission in the Indian Ocean. But as the cruiser set off into open waters, Captain Müller knew survival meant more than speed and firepower. It would take deception. For this, the skipper ordered a 4th funnel rigged midship, transforming Emden's sleek profile into a convincing illusion of a British county-class cruiser. Although a simple trick, merchants might mistake her for an escort and let their guard down, giving the German warship enough time to close in on prey before they realized their mistake. By August 29th, the 2 ships had pushed into the Indian Ocean's Bay of Bengal, a lifeline for British merchant traffic. They'd gone completely undetected, since the British assumed Emden was still with Spee's squadron. As September began, Emden, operating on shipping routes without success, began to run out of coal. Approaching the British colony of Ceylon on the night of September 9th, a growingly worried Müller ordered his officers to scan the sea for smoke and lights in the darkness when a distant glow suddenly flickered against the horizon. A ship. Like a wolf breaking into the sheepfold. With engines roaring as Emden closed in at full speed, she was within range of the target in minutes. After shooting the target across her bow, forcing her to stop, the Germans realized this was the Greek steamer Pantopouros. Though a neutral nation, when the boarding party realized the ship was under contract to deliver 6,500 tons of coal to the British naval base at Bombay, Müller presented her captain with 2 options: seize the boat outright, or sail with Emden and supply her with coal, promising he could keep his crew and vessel intact. When the Greek captain agreed to the latter offer, Pantopouros became a part of Emden's task force, buying the Germans more time, and Müller had no intention of wasting the advantage. At the time, British shipping at the Bay of Bengal was generally safe. Then, from one moment to another, a single German ship turned it into a full-blown battleground. According to the official German archives on the SMS Emden, quote, "She wanted to disturb the British supply lines like a wolf breaking into the sheepfold, doing as much damage as she could while avoiding superior enemy naval forces." On the morning of September 10th, 1914, Emden's lookout spotted a British steamer on the horizon. Despite strange white structures lining her deck, which raised suspicion, Müller took the risk. Closing in, the Germans signaled the Brits to stop their engines. But as the boarding party climbed over the rails, weapons ready, they found horse stalls instead of guns. This vessel was the SS Indus, a British transport carrying Indian Army cavalry mounts. Upon seizing the luxury cargo, the crew was removed, and before anyone knew it, a series of depth charges put Indus below the water. Before the week was over, 2 more ships, SS Lovett and SS Killen, merchant ships just as defenseless as the first, repeated the same pattern. Their cargoes were taken, their crews removed, and their wrecks sent to the sea floor, each one a warning to every British vessel still sailing these waters. The Bay of Bengal was no longer safe. Madras. Müller and the men aboard SMS Emden weren't just hunting ships. They also never missed a chance to launch a full-scale attack. On September 22, 1914, the vessel targeted Madras, a city home to the Burma Oil Company's massive storage facility. Destroying it would severely damage British fuel reserves in the region and send a message across the empire. At the time, an Indian coastal city had not seen an attack in generations, and Madras was unguarded, its streets still glowing with lights despite the blackout order. But the British weren't entirely defenseless, as shore batteries stood ready for retaliation. For Müller, the temptation was too big. As Emden glided toward the coastline, preparing to strike just before 10 p.m., the ship slowed to a crawl, less than 2 miles off the coast. Before striking, the skipper reminded his gunners to be very careful so that not a single shell would hit the city beyond the target. The first shots missed their mark, one soaring too far, the other striking the shore. The crew adjusted, knowing the next would count. The third shell hit, rupturing a tank and sending oil surging out. Moments later, fire erupted, lighting up the harbor at Madras. Aboard Emden, sailors erupted in cheers. With Madras now awake, Emden's gunners adjusted their aim. One salvo slammed right into a second tank, which turned out to be empty. But as the next shell tore through the well-stocked storage yard, thick smoke swallowed the sky, burning no less than 5,000 tons of oil within minutes. Finally, the British shore batteries opened up, sending shells whistling toward the sea. But their efforts were too little and too late, and Emden held her course back into the ocean, completely unfazed, as the salvos splashed into the water. Around them, Madras burned violently. Panic gripped the city, and people fled into the streets, fearing more action. No one had expected a warship to strike their coast. The Brits and the entire world had just witnessed something they weren't prepared to admit. There was a new ship reigning over the Indian Ocean. The most chivalrous enemy. By the time Emden attacked Madras on September 22, 1914, she had already sunk or captured 10 ships. But despite racking up victory after victory, there was one thing Captain Müller never abandoned: gallantry. Every single time the Emden took a prize, her crew treated captives with dignity. Merchant sailors were given time to collect their belongings, sometimes even provisions for the journey ahead. If women or children were aboard, the ship was released. As word spread of the fearsome German ship, panic rapidly gripped the shipping lanes of the Far East. From Suez to Singapore, Japan to Australia, merchants refused to sail. The British, of course, were utterly humiliated. In just a single month, a single cruiser cut off from friendly ports managed to outmaneuver 4 enemy navies and caused shipping in the Indian Ocean to fall by a whopping 60%. As a result, the chambers of commerce were in an uproar, sending desperate telegrams, passing resolutions, and demanding action. With this massive crisis in their hands, 78 British, French, Russian, and Japanese warships flooded the Indian Ocean. They scoured the sea for the elusive German cruiser, hunting her across thousands of miles of open water. Despite all measures, with Emden sinking ships faster than they could be replaced, rather than risk more warships being lost or captured, the British made the decision to pull vessels from the region altogether. In early October, after weeks of raiding, Emden turned toward Diego Garcia, a remote British colony administered by Mauritius, sitting over 1,000 miles south of India. Knowing a British port meant British guns, Müller expected one hell of a fight. But as Emden glided into the lagoon, there were no cannons, no alarm, no warships waiting to intercept. Instead, the islanders welcomed her. As it turned out, news of the war hadn't reached Diego Garcia. To the British residents in the area, Germany was still a friendly nation. Müller, seizing the sudden opportunity, docked Emden safely and openly. For the first time in weeks, the crew rested, ate fresh food, bathed, and repainted their uniforms, while engineers worked on much-needed repairs, patching damage from the long voyage and replenishing their coal stores, giving the cruiser the fuel she needed to keep hunting. Before leaving, the ever-gallant Müller made sure to repay the islanders' hospitality by restoring a local's broken boat. By the time Emden sailed out after nearly a week, she was as good as new and ready to strike again. Steaming north toward the Laccadive Islands, Emden struck again, sinking 5 more steamers, including a Tasmanian dredger, and captured another large collier in mid-October. Then, she vanished. Weeks later, More than 1,700 miles from her last reported sighting, she finally reappeared, according to the United States Naval Institute, quote, in a manner spectacular enough to please the most jaded imagination. Friend or foe? Towards the end of October, Müller set his sights on Penang, a strategic port in British-controlled Malaysia. A vital stop along Allied trade routes, the harbor was home to merchant traffic, warships, and supply depots, a tempting target for Emden, especially since its defenses were minimal. At early dawn on October 29th, Penang's usual bustle of tugs, launches, and sampans was absent. Mostly everyone was still asleep. There, a heavy tropical mist clung to the water, slowly lifting like a curtain revealing a stage, one about to witness chaos. Through the early morning haze, Emden's lookout spotted a warship sitting in the harbor, her lights still burning. It was the Russian cruiser Zemchug, a veteran ship in Penang for boiler repairs. With only one of them operational, this meant she couldn't sail, couldn't maneuver, and worse, her ammunition hoists weren't powered. She was the perfect target. Aboard the Russian cruiser Zemchug, the quartermaster on watch took notice of a steamer emerging from the east. Though she was a blur in the dim light and the distance, to the trained eye, this was no merchant vessel, but a warship. Through the spyglass, the shape became more apparent. A two-masted cruiser with 4 funnels, a profile all British warships shared. Believing there was no reason for concern, the quartermaster breathed a sigh of relief. This had to be HMS Yarmouth, known to be in the area. While the officer briefly considered sounding the alarm, the quiet stillness of the morning made the thought seem absurd. Indeed, no enemy would dare strike here. With quiet confidence, the incoming warship continued toward its anchorage, closing within just 300 yards of Zemchug's beam. Aboard the newcomer, every man was awake, ready, waiting. Aboard the Russian vessel, however, most were still asleep. The deception unraveled in an instant as the German ensign shot up the mast, and only a moment later, Emden's broadside erupted, the first salvo crashing into Zemchug's exposed hull at point-blank range. Aboard the Russian cruiser, confusion turned to horror as enemy shells tore through steel, ripping into the decks, the explosion sending half-asleep sailors scrambling from their bunks. Then came a torpedo, whose impact shuddered right through her hull, a powerful and crushing detonation that sent a wall of water and flame skyward. A second salvo followed, then another, making the harbor alive with panic and sheer chaos. Though the crew tried to return fire, it was already too late. Zemchug was sinking. As the vessel listed heavily, her stern dipping toward the sea, the eerie and beautiful mist that had drifted across Penang at dawn had been replaced by a thick, rolling curtain of black smoke that, when it began to clear, revealed only Zemchug's masts remained above the water, while her scattered survivors shouted for help in the midst of the wreckage. Through the chaos, only 15 minutes after making first contact, Emden was already slipping away. Before leaving Penang, however, Emden also sank Musquet, a French destroyer, stopping only long enough to pick up her survivors. After this, the elusive German raider, despite a speedy chase from 2 nearby French destroyers, once again disappeared into the high seas. Not until November 9th was she again heard of, and once again, a tropical island was the object of her attention. Cocos Islands. Emden's next target was the Cocos Islands, a remote British-controlled atoll deep in the Indian Ocean. Though the location itself meant little, what sat there was invaluable. A high-priority undersea cable and radio station, a lifeline for British communications across the Indian Ocean that connected Australia, India, Africa, and beyond. On November 9th, 1914, Müller and his crew had been monitoring radio traffic and believed no enemy warships were close enough to interfere. Unknown to them, an Allied troop convoy was just 55 miles away, steaming under strict radio silence with a powerful escort. With Emden was her coal ship, Boresk, a British vessel captured earlier, which Müller ordered to wait nearby while Emden moved in for the attack. Just after dawn, second-in-command Captain Lieutenant Helmut von Mucke led a 50-man landing party in 3 boats, carrying rifles and demolition charges, heading to shore on Direction Island to destroy the vital structures with their own hands. Most of Emden's top gunners were among them to ensure the job was done fast. Just then, as a single Chinese worker spotted Emden, he sprinted at full speed toward the telegraph station, breathless as he burst inside and typed in Morse code, quote, "SOS, Emden here." Müller heard the distress call the moment it was sent and immediately barked orders to jam the signal. But it was too late, as the message was already racing through the undersea cable and across the airwaves. British warships would soon be on their way. The captain pressed on. Emden held position offshore, while on Direction Island, von Mucke's landing party worked undisturbed, all completely unaware that time was running out. Approximately 1,800 miles away from Emden, the British ship HMS Minotaur, part of the Royal Navy's broader hunt for German commerce raiders in the Indian Ocean, was the first to receive the distress signal. Only 5 months before, many of the men aboard the ship had shared drinks with Emden's crew in Tsingtao. While her guns were more than capable of taking down the German raider, with her top speed of 23 knots, she could never catch a more agile enemy. Further south, another warship was in the perfect position to respond. Australian and New Zealand Army Corps Convoy 1, carrying thousands of troops to the Middle East, was sailing from Albany, Western Australia, toward the Suez Canal, when they intercepted the message that Emden was in the Cocos Islands. Among the escorts of the convoy was HMAS Sydney, a Chatham-class light cruiser. By the outbreak of World War I, she was under the command of Captain John Glossop, a seasoned British officer serving in the newly formed Australian fleet. Up to this point, Sydney had spent most of the war escorting troop convoys across the Indian Ocean, ensuring safe passage for thousands of soldiers bound for Europe. She had yet to see combat, but that was about to change. Faster, better, stronger. Bigger, faster, and more heavily armed than Emden, she was precisely the type of ship for the job. And within moments, HMAS Sydney was turning hard, her engines roaring as she sailed at full speed toward the unsuspecting German enemy. As Emden held position offshore, von Mucke's landing party worked quickly, smashing equipment and setting charges inside the telegraph station, while the German cruiser remained near the harbor entrance, keeping watch. At 8:45 a.m., with his unease growing at a rapid pace, Müller signaled for the landing party to return, raising flags and blaring the ship's siren. But as minutes dragged by, von Mucke and his men were still ashore and focused on their work, oblivious to the danger closing in. Just after 9 a.m., Lookout spotted a warship racing over the horizon. Knowing this could either be their coal ship or a fearsome enemy, Müller didn't hesitate. With his order, Emden's engines fired as she turned away and headed for the open ocean, leaving 50 of her own men stranded on the island. Only 15 minutes later, the realization hit. This wasn't Brisk, but an enemy cruiser coming straight for them. As everyone rushed to their stations, Müller turned to his gunnery officers, demanding firing solutions. That's when it hit him. All 10 men trained to aim and fire Emden's primary batteries were still ashore, cut off with no way back. Now, there was nothing left but to try and fight back. Right at the harbor entrance, Emden struck first, sending a salvo straight at the approaching Australian warship just before Müller turned hard, trying to escape. The shell slammed into Sydney's superstructure, damaging both fire control stations and destroying one of her rangefinders. A solid hit, but not enough to slow her down. Then the chase began. Sydney's 6-inch guns had the range advantage, and Emden's fire was falling short. Müller's gunners worked fast, but the Australian cruiser was already closing in. By the time she angled into position and brought her full broadside to bear, Emden was already in trouble. The first direct hit ripped through her funnel, sending crushed metal clattering onto the deck. Then, in quick succession, a mast came crashing down, followed by a second funnel, torn away by the Australian gunners. The fire then rapidly spread aft, smoke pouring into the sky, as her once feared frame was reduced to a battered wreck. With no hope of escape, Emden turned north, running aground on a reef. Her hull shuddered as she slammed into the coral. Even then, as flames consumed her frame, she refused to go quietly. With one operational gun left, Emden's guns roared again. One salvo, then another, then a third, until at last the German flag came down, marking the first Australian victory of the war. With it, the reign of the most feared raider in the Indian Ocean was over. The legacy of Emden. During her 96-day raiding campaign, SMS Emden wreaked havoc across the Indian Ocean, sinking or capturing 30 ships and destroying or seizing over 100,000 tons of enemy shipping. Her targets were wide-ranging, from undefended merchant steamers to vital oil depots and beyond. Though the Battle of Cocos was the end of Emden, her story didn't stop there. As the war drew to a close, Müller walked free from his prison in Malta. He returned to Germany as a hero and was promoted. Admiration for him was not limited to his homeland. Even among Germany's sworn enemies, many expressed their personal pleasure that Commander von Müller, the gallant and sportsmanlike commanding officer of Emden, had survived the war. The London Daily Telegraph wrote, quote, "He has shown himself an officer and a gentleman. He has been enterprising, cool, and daring in making war on our shipping, and has revealed a nice sense of humor. He has, moreover, shown every possible consideration to the crews of his prizes. The war on the sea will lose something of its piquancy, its humor, and its interest, now that the Emden has gone." As for his crew, every officer received the Iron Cross First Class, while the rest, including the ship herself, were awarded the Iron Cross Second Class. Some loyal crew members took it further, changing their last names to Emden and carrying the name all the way to the modern day. 3 more Emden cruisers would be built after the war, each marked with an Iron Cross on the hull, a tribute to the raider that had humiliated the world's greatest navy. Even outside Germany, her name refused to fade. In southern India, where Emden had once set fire to British oil depots, the name took on a life of its own. In the years that followed, Tamil speakers searched for a word to describe someone who was sharp, elusive, and impossible to catch. They chose Emden.